Los Angeles was a very rough and primitive place.
It's just like a completely lawless bunch of bandits.
Everyone in Los Angeles had a gun at that point. In fact, this was known as one of the most dangerous cities in the country.
Human life was about the cheapest thing there was in Los Angeles.
It really was a bachelor society.
The highest per capita murder rate in American history.
Very, very few women who came here from China.
Young women would be kidnapped in China.
There were families that would sell their daughters as young as 5 years old.
And they're sold on the auction block.
It was the total wild, 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 seriously wild West.
Women would be essentially owned by different gangs.
The young woman had to work as a prostitute for 4 years.
So there were a lot of brothels in that time.
She was paid no wages.
These women had a tremendous amount of monetary value.
It sort of proved to the rest of the country how terrible the West was.
There were several events leading up to what became known as the Night of Horrors. The buildings were looted.
Some of the policemen on duty rushed to the scene.
Caught in the crossfire is a rancher named Robert Thompson.
Mr. Thompson was actually much more deliberate and reckless in provoking what happened.
Chinese are starting to be driven out of their homes.
Where were the teachers? Where were these people in influential positions?
The discriminatory legacy, that part of American history, I think there's a certain celebration.
The American dream is so important for all of us.
The American dream, I think, really shifted for people over time.
The dream was much more difficult to achieve.
Consummate professional is how I would also describe Anna May Wong.
Aggression, a woman who wasn't afraid to be attractive, and yet here she was, tough and strong.
American-educated Madame Chiang Kai-shek.
Anna May Wong was definitely typecast, the submissive slave.
We all had someone in our families that was crazy enough to make this incredible voyage to come to the United States.
I was born 1911, so this year is what? I'm 103, 103. My father was a Chinese herb doctor. He studied medicine in China. And when he came to America, he continued being a Chinese medical doctor. And so he had a practice on Hill Street. You cannot say Dr. Y.H. Chung. It's just Y.H. Chung, herbalist. But there was one doctor who got around it. See, D.R. Chan. See? So from a distance, you saw Dr. Chan.
Immigrants. Those who leave the only homes they have ever known to embark on a fearful journey in search of a better life. We are all their descendants from one time or another, from one place or another. The Chinese immigrants who began arriving on the shores of America over a century and a half ago called America Gamsan, Gold Mountain. It was a place of hope. Amongst those new immigrants were women, with stories both tragic and triumphant. But at the beginning, for too many of them, there was a terrible price to pay.
A lot of people think that the first Chinese immigrants to the West Coast came to build a railroad in the 1860s. Actually, the first large wave came for the gold rush of 1849. Like people from other parts of the world, the Chinese immigrants hoped to get rich quickly in what they called Gold Mountain.
People had come out of the Taiping Rebellion, millions of people killed. You'd had droughts and famines and floods, and just and everyone was so poor. During the time of the gold rush and later during the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, and then all the way up until about 1950, it really was a bachelor society. Very, very few women who came here from China. I mean, California, it was about 1 woman for every 20 men.
Because I think in American history, what's happened is that people have come to this country as immigrants. They establish sometimes immigrant enclaves, sometimes they're bigger neighborhoods. And typically, they form families and they have children, and the children are U.S. citizens, and the children move away from those communities and they enter in some way the American mainstream, linguistically, educationally, professionally. And that type of growth that is central, I think, to the American immigrant experience was greatly restricted by the fact that Chinese Americans largely became what they call a bachelor society.
So what does that mean? You know, men are kind of left to their own devices when they will gamble, they smoked opium, and yes, they went to visit prostitutes. So there were a lot of brothels in that time.
I looked at some maps, particularly a map of downtown Los Angeles in 1888, and each building has written on it what that building's purpose was. So it might say blacksmith or dry goods. And I noticed on this map, all along Alameda for 3 blocks, every single building said HS of IF. And I asked the staff at the Seaver Center for Western History Research, what does this mean? And they said, House of Ill Fame. So all of Alameda was prostitution. So this was, in some ways, the red light district of Los Angeles.
So many women, most of them forgotten, but the stories of a few still remain. Though tragic, they revealed the price so many paid to survive on the Gold Mountain.
A young woman named Xing Yi had been purchased and was taken to San Bernardino to work as a prostitute. The men who were keeping her took her to the outskirts of town where no one would see, ripped off her clothes, they tied her to a tree and started beating her with sticks. Then they built a fire, they took some burning sticks and pressed it against her skin. And then started beating her again. They finally released her, and when the men started walking away, she tried to follow them and stay with them. Chinese prostitutes were terrified of non-Asians in America. They had been taught from an early age that Westerners were barbarians, and so they were much more frightened of the prospect of falling into the hands of Anglos or Latinos than they were staying with these men who were mistreating them.
Gangs called tongs in Chinatown, and they ran businesses, and one of the businesses that they ran was prostitution. So women would be essentially owned by different gangs. The gangs would have conflict, and one of the ways that they claimed ownership in a legal sense in the United States was to marry a prostitute to a member of that particular tong.
Again, you know, I hate to go back to these stereotypes, but they were part of the history of gambling, opium, and prostitution. So all of that is there, and it's all being run mostly by these different tongs, rival tongs. These women lived in really terrible circumstances, in a tiny room, sometimes with just a little fenced window to look out of.
Women just kind of almost stacked in these small spaces where their customers would come.
Really, you know, venereal disease with no cure, no way, you know, who knows how many customers they would have in a day, in a night.
Escaping from the clutches of sexual slavery was close to impossible. The legal system offered no remedy. If a prostitute escaped, her brothel owner would have her charged with theft, and she would be captured and returned.
Once she was brought back, the brothel owner would come back and say, "Sorry, it was all a mistake," or "I learned that it was someone else who stole my money." and then the court officials would release the woman back into his custody. So the brothel owners actually used the law as a way of getting these women back into sexual slavery.
And it's much like what happened in the South when slaves would run away, and there was a whole business of tracking slaves down and bringing them back because they made so much money for their owners.
The women who worked in brothels had very few ways of escaping that life. Some of them did marry Chinese laborers. A few, once they got older, did manage to find other work as laundresses or perhaps seamstresses or cooks. Sadly, many of them became addicted to opium, perhaps came down with a chronic illness, in which case they would be expelled from the brothel and just be left to die in the streets.
There were a lot of women who killed themselves by swallowing opium or swallowing gold or any myriad ways. It was just very, very tough for them.
The Chinese prostitutes, of course, were pressured to solicit as many clients as possible because they only charged 25 cents per client.
So it cost about $96 a year to feed them and clothe them and take care of them. And the brothel owner made about $850 a year off of them. So if a young woman ran away, there was quite a business in chasing those women down.
Unable to stand the grief of endless bondage, some women took their own lives. Others, almost as desperate, took their chances and ran away. Xing Yu was such a woman.
The first incident involving Xing Yu happened in August of 1870. That time she was kidnapped by a rival dealer in prostitution who was trying to take her out of town and sell her.
Her owner, who was a notorious boss, used the legal system to recapture her. He filed a complaint accusing her of stealing jewelry and offered a reward for her capture. This started a manhunt with law officers competing to get the reward.
The lawmen who went after these women and tried to bring them back, of course, were very much aware of conditions in Chinatown. Again, I think they were so tempted by the money that they didn't care. They realized they were bringing these women back to slavery, and I don't think they were that bothered by it.
It turned out that the rival dealer has hired a gangster to kidnap and transport Xing Yu out of town. But the offer of a reward put a stop to this plan. In the end, Xing Yu was arrested. A judge, seeing that she was a victim and not a thief, dismissed the charges against her. She was released to her previous owner. In less than 2 months, Xing Yu will be on the run again.
The second time, she ran away probably with a lover, and her owner again offered a $100 reward for her return. 2 Los Angeles lawmen were competing with each other to try to bring her back and get the reward from the Chinese businessmen.
Xing Yu made it all the way to the city of Wilmington, with the 2 groups of law officers on her heels competing to capture her and claim the reward. They finally caught up with her in the city of Anaheim, where she has hired a coach for the next leg of her escape. And for the second time in 2 months, she was captured and again put to work as a prostitute.
The third incident involving Xing Yu happened in December of 1870, and that's when the sheriff of Santa Barbara came to try to collect her on a warrant that had been issued there and take her to Santa Barbara. The Chinese rallied in the street to try to prevent her from being taken away. The Chinese at that time were divided into two factions, and yet for this brief moment, it seemed like the members of the two factions were both involved in trying to prevent the American law officers from taking her away. After these three incidents with Xing Yu in the latter part of 1870, she disappeared from recorded history in Los Angeles.
While most of the women were treated as no more than property to be used and traded, they posed little threat. But as more Chinese settled in, the ugly strain of racism began to rear its head. Now, the violence that had been visited on solitary women burst into flames that put an entire ethnic group in grave peril.
There were several events leading up to what became known as the Night of Horrors.
One of the most highly publicized incidents happened in March 1871, which was 7 months before the Chinese massacre.
A young woman, Hut Ho, is brought over here, and she marries a man, Hing Sing. But a Tong comes and says, no, she actually belongs to us.
One day, some members of the faction arrived at Hing Sing's house while he was away, and they kidnapped Yut Ho. They took her before the Justice of the Peace, and they forced her to marry a man from the opposing faction.
So she was married in a bigamous fashion to both men, and the one gang had taken possession of her.
In October 1871, one faction brought in some Tong assassins from San Francisco to take revenge on the other faction. There was a brief gunfight in the street. Several people were arrested. They were jailed, and the next day they were brought into court. All of them were released on bail. Late in the afternoon, gunfire breaks out again in Chinatown between the members of these two rival factions.
They're fighting. This isn't all that unusual. But caught in the crossfire is a rancher named Robert Thompson, a white rancher. And now suddenly word goes out across the city, and the phrase is, they're killing whites wholesale. And basically the whole city descends on Chinatown.
About 500 converged on Chinatown and started looting the stores and assaulting the Chinese, and immediately started hanging them as retribution for this one white man that had been killed.
They placed ropes around their necks. They started dragging them through the streets, and at 3 different locations in downtown Los Angeles, they ended up hanging a total of 15 Chinese men. 3 had already been shot and killed at the Coronel Adobe, for a total of 18 victims. One was a 15-year-old boy named Ah Lu, who had just arrived from China a week earlier. Another man was a musician who had just arrived from San Francisco on the last steamer and had only been in Los Angeles a few days.
The buildings were looted, businesses were destroyed, buildings were burnt down.
The best-known victim was a popular physician named Jean Tong.
He was an herbalist and very well respected. He spoke English and Spanish and was pretty integrated into the community.
When he was dragged out of his home, he and his wife, Tong Yu, were clasping each other. They were separated by the mob. They took him to a place called Tomlinson's Corral, which had been used for lynchings in the past. And there, Dr. Tong pleaded for his life. In English, he offered his captors his entire life savings.
He was not only lynched, but also shot in the mouth. And then once he was strung up, his pants were stolen and his finger was cut off, sort of as a souvenir.
There were some citizens of Los Angeles who were doing whatever they could to try to stop it. attorney named Robert Whitney,
who ended up being a judge at the trial against the worst of the perpetrators. He would take men and he would have them in his company, and he'd say to people would say, oh, we've got to get those guys, and they'd say, oh no, these are just women. So he sort of snuck them out as though they were women. There were many, many people who hid Chinese in their basements, in their attics, in the jail to protect them. But by morning, there were these 17 men and boys who had been killed. We have to recognize that there was a lot of pent-up rage and anger and fear about the Chinese.
The nation's response was horror at this terrible thing that had happened. Even though there was not a lot of sympathy toward the Chinese, it sort of proved to the rest of the country how terrible the West was and how ungovernable the people were there. And it just, for people in Chicago or New York, it just sort of fed the stereotype of California and the West being out of control.
This news, though, was sensational. I mean, it had some real sensational qualities for the sensational press. And that did spread across the country. It was widely, widely covered.
The Chinese massacre turned out to be a public relations disaster for the city of Los Angeles. It was the first incident that drew nationwide attention to Los Angeles.
This was such a blight on the city. Most people in the country had never even heard of Los Angeles. They'd never heard of it. It was just some little, podunk place.
In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and that was further discrimination against the Chinese.
This is already the period of the driving out. So in other parts of the West, Chinese are starting to be driven out of their homes. Seattle, Tacoma, loaded onto rafts set adrift at sea. In Tucson, Chinese being tied onto the backs of steers and being sent out into the desert to die.
These were not isolated incidents. It was a part of an anti-Chinese hate wave sweeping the nation. In Rock Springs, Wyoming, 28 Chinese were massacred. In Snake River, Washington, 31 Chinese were massacred. In Alaska, Chinese citizens were put into boats and set adrift. In Denver, Colorado, Chinatown was looted and its residents assaulted. In Tacoma, Washington, all Chinese citizens were forced out of town. In Tombstone, Arizona, all Chinese citizens were forced out of town.
I think it was a general atmosphere between the Americans and the Chinese. Their impression of the Chinese were just railroad workers. Because when I was in junior high or elementary school, the kids would sing, "Ching Chong Chinaman sitting on the rail. Along came a train and chopped off his tail." His tail.
As if the persistent racism wasn't enough, in 1882, it became enshrined as official government policy in the Chinese Exclusion Act, the only law of its kind to be passed in the history of the United States, and it had a devastating impact on the Chinese community.
If you talk to a Chinese American who has some ancestry in this country, every single one will have some story about the negative effect of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
A century ago, the Chinese came here in search of a better life, but they faced harsh conditions, particularly in the halls of Congress. Congress passed numerous laws to restrict Chinese Americans, starting from the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, to stop the Chinese from immigrating, from becoming naturalized citizens, and from ever having the right to vote. These were the only such laws to target a specific ethnic group. The Chinese were the only residents that had to carry papers on them at all times. They were often harassed and detained. If they couldn't produce the proper documents, authorities threw them into prison or out of the country, regardless of their citizenship status.
My own grandfather, of course, as every Chinese American, had to carry papers on him at all times or else be deported, even though he was here legally. And if that happened to him, only the testimony of a white person could save him. And that was actually in the law.
The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was designed to bar the immigration of all Chinese to the United States, except for 4 categories: those who were ministers, students, diplomats, or merchants.
It actually named Chinese Americans as a group to exclude. In fact, it is the only law that actually named a group for exclusion in the actual Code of Congress.
Initially, the Chinese immigrants were welcomed in California, partly because there was a labor shortage, and they were well received. It was predicted that they would assimilate within a few years. The anti-Chinese sentiment didn't begin to develop strongly until about the mid-1860s, after the Civil War.
There was festering resentment against the Chinese because they were perceived as taking lower paying jobs away from other people in the population. And the economy was not great. The middle of the 19th century was pretty bad.
And so there was a strong prejudice about what was called cheap Chinese labor. In reality, if you look at the wage scales of Chinese workers at that time, Chinese workers in agriculture and on the railroad crews and in mining were typically paid lower wages than Anglos or Latinos.
We have Chinese exclusion cutting off a labor force, labor supply that had been instrumental to all kinds of development, economic development, particularly in the Western United States. That gets cut off. And so there's always this back and forth between what the law provides and what the economy demands.
So my great-great-grandfather was actually the first person in my family to come here from China. So many of those early men were going over as sojourners. I'm going to come, I'm going to save up my money, I'm going to go home, I'm going to buy some nice land, and my wife and I are going to live happily ever after. And that was really the goal in the beginning. People didn't come here intending to stay. It was just a place to get rich and go home. But once those families start to come, you start to see this shift in Chinatown and the first children who were born here. So what happens, as you sort of start to transition from a totally bachelor society to a society with families? And so now we want to be a part of the community and what that means to build that community. It sort of covers all of those things: food, education, traditions, culture.
The women were at the heart of this transformation from a bachelor's society to a true Chinese community. It was they who kept the lights of the Chinatowns burning as they worked alongside the men, bore and raised children, and passed on traditions. Bit by bit, little by little, Chinatowns were erected all around the United States. The Chinese were no longer sojourners. America had become their home.
Think about immigration in some kind of a static sense, that we're the population that we are, we've created the us, but everyone else who comes new, that's the them, those are the newcomers, and now it's time to close the gates or pull up the ladder or whatever, however else you want to describe it. But I think it's also been important to the idea of nation immigrants to understand that part of being a nation of immigrants is not just something that's frozen in time. It's really a process. And part of that process is to understand that over time, people come to this country and they're newcomers. But over a generation or two, people who start out as them become part of us.
And so slowly, the Chinese were integrated into the fabric of America. They had long been laborers and merchants. Now they entered the professions, and they entered the arts. As the movie industry that grew out of Hollywood changed the world forever, a Chinese girl looked towards the silver screen and dared to dream.
Hollywood as a filmmaking industry started in 1910, and by the mid to late teens, you were just getting companies founded almost every day out here. Anna May Wong, who was like the top Chinese American actress, very well respected, a really fine actress. Unfortunately, she was caught in this strange netherworld, as it were.
While Hollywood produced many films that capitalized on the exoticism of Chinese themes that audiences flocked to see, Chinese characters were constantly portrayed in a negative and stereotypical light. Furthermore, Chinese roles were mostly filled by Caucasian actors who utilized a makeup practice called yellow face.
You wouldn't dare.
Wong has dared many things. He will continue to dare. One day, when he is acclaimed by all Keelot.
But despite the odds stacked against her, Anna May Wong believed in her dreams and was determined to be a star.
Anna May Wong is born in 1903 in Los Angeles. And, she's the second daughter of 7 children to Wong Sam Sing, who is a laundryman.
Anna May's childhood was very difficult. She was one of several children born to basically a working class family in downtown Los Angeles. They lived in the Chinatown area of Los Angeles at the time. Her childhood was hard because she worked at her family's laundry business. So right away you can say that she had a very hard life. But she also had a great imagination. And she was very mischievous and very curious. So whenever she had to take the laundry, delivered the laundry to her father's customers, a lot of times in downtown LA at that time, they were filming silent movies. So she would kind of stop, put her basket down, and kind of just start watching. And she started asking everybody questions. She would just go up to an extra, she would go up to the actors, to the director, to the cinematographer, and just start asking questions like, what's that camera for? Why is she doing that? What's the story about? And they got used to her, and they started calling her the curious Chinese child.
Anna May Wong was third-generation Chinese American, but she thought of herself and was perceived as Chinese. The concept of Chinese American doesn't really take hold until after World War II.
What was interesting is that she kind of looked very different from a lot of Chinese people back then because she was unusually tall at 5'7". She had huge eyes and this incredibly distinctive heart-shaped face. So I think Anna May Wong always knew she stuck out in a crowd, whether it was a crowd of white people or a crowd of Chinese people. She knew she was unique. She was very well aware of her beauty as a young girl. But I think the struggle she came up with was realizing how people didn't quite see her as beautiful.
Anna May is quite aware of the impact of Western society upon her. And so she says, East and West are fighting inside me like cats, and I don't know who's going to win.
Anna May Wong definitely struggled having to play these very stereotyped, demeaning roles. You know, she definitely knew some of the stuff she was doing was not in a positive light for Chinese people. But I think in the end, when you look at her movies, You can see a little bit of revenge because she acts so well in these movies, and she gives a dignity and the best she can with the limited roles that she has. And what's ironic is she stole the show every time. Thief of Baghdad, she's a minor character. She's a Mongol slave. Everybody loved her. They're like, who's that beautiful woman? She stole the show from Douglas Fairbanks. Come on.
They say her eyes are on fire, her lips are screaming. It's so over the top and wonderful, but you see a lot of other people, Sojin, talking about her eyes. Walter Benjamin talks about her eyes. He said all of life flows through her eyes. Anna May Wong oftentimes wore outfits that would overwhelm her audiences. Sometimes these were Chinese outfits, but she was very fashionable. Okay? In 1934, she was voted the best dressed woman in the world. She had the aura of a true star. And as a result, she was always in people's minds.
You are very nervous today.
Well, I can't help
She could only go so far, right? She was Chinese. She could never kiss anyone in the movies. She could never have a happy ending. She could never get married. It was a very kind of limited roles that she could have.
Anna May Wong was definitely typecast in her movies. She's been described in some movies as the manipulative Oriental vamp, dragon lady, the submissive slave.
Her family would not have regarded this with approval. In fact, they didn't. There's an old Chinese saying that you don't want your son to be a soldier, you don't want your daughter to be an actress. Indeed, in Chinese culture, actresses are seen barely above courtesans and prostitutes. This was not a field that any respectable family would want to see their daughter go to.
There definitely was friction with her family. They were not happy, and they felt that it was disgraceful. It went against Chinese tradition, and it was not what a proper lady should do. In fact, at one point, her dad said, "All right, I want you to get a real job." So she became a secretary. She was terrible at it, just absolutely terrible. She couldn't do shorthand. She was terrible. So she realized, in a way, she became an actress too, because that was the only thing she could really do.
The Hollywood Production Code and anti-miscegenation laws forbade any portrayals of intimacy between different races. Without the Hollywood on-screen kiss with a leading man, Anna May Wong would never be a leading lady and would never reach the summit of her profession.
He asked me to come. Mr. Young asked me.
We're both in the same house now. You're good at remembering. Remember to leave him alone.
The anti-miscegenation laws influenced Hollywood to have first an informal code, and then in the 1930s a formal code, which forbade any suggestion of sexual intimacy between a Chinese person and a white person.
If Hollywood allowed actors of color to kiss white actors on screen, she could have lived and gotten married, or there could have been the wedding scene, or she could have had a happily ever after. But she was the tragic Asian, sacrificing herself for the white man, or just all that kind of stuff. So I think she got a little tired of it, and I don't blame her for leaving to Europe. Anna May Wong left Europe after a very successful few years of being a very popular movie star. She was in a bunch of movies that were very well received. Critics even called her a transcendent talent. And so she came back to Hollywood saying, I paid my dues, I've played all your stereotype roles, I am set, give me my movie role. And that movie role that would change her career and take her to the next level was the role of Olan in Pearl S. Buck's novel, The Good Earth.
Pearl S. Buck's Pulitzer and Nobel Prize-winning book depicted the Chinese with authenticity and humanity. The book captured America's imagination about China, and a movie adaptation soon followed.
After MGM acquires the rights And everybody recognizes they can't film it in China. The question is who's going to play the key roles. Okay? And it had always been presumed, and Pearl Buck wanted them to have Chinese actors doing this. Given that, the role of Olan, there was really only one answer, and that was Anna May Wong, because she is the most important Chinese actress of her time.
Anna May Wong knew this was the role she was born to play, and lobbied endlessly for the lead role. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for all these years, and she knew her time had come.
But unfortunately, too, the way the American film public was, as well as the American film industry, that we had Caucasian characters play the main Chinese roles.
Paul Muni is cast in the role of Wong Lung. Once that happens, once they get this important star as the principal character, there's simply no way that Anna May Wong can get up the opposite role because of all of the anti-miscegenation codes. Okay? She cannot play the wife of a white man.
It had to have been one of the greatest disappointments of Anna May Wong's life, because here, as a Chinese American woman, it would be such an honor to represent your culture in such a major film, and to be replaced by someone that is not of your culture, that it just had been terribly disappointing to her.
So the role then goes to Luz Rainer, who is a contract player for MGM. She'd done a couple of small movies, and she goes on to win the Oscar for this movie.
Maybe she won Anna May's Oscar, we'll never know. But that was, I think, the straw that broke the camel's back for Anna May Wong. That was a watershed moment in her life. A lot of sexy rumors about her love life, let's just say that. So I think that she definitely knew what she was doing, and I think it's the devil you know when it comes to stuff like that.
The real love of her life is Eric Maschwitz. He writes a very beautiful song for her, These Foolish Things. It's a wonderful, wonderful song. A cigarette that bears the lipstick's traces, airline tickets to romantic places. These foolish things remind me of you. Is Anna May. I mean, she was somebody, who lived life hard, who drank hard and smoked a lot, and also traveled everywhere. And so Maschwitz sort of captures her a little bit there. She died at 56 from cirrhosis of the liver, which is a chronic alcohol-related disease. And mind you, all of her siblings lived into their 80s and 90s. So the family pattern was to live for decades past what Anna May was able to achieve.
When you look at her movies today, you start to realize there's a certain dignity and a certain humanity she gives to those very, very limited roles. And people have now come around, and now the tide has turned, and now she's considered a hero for at least trying to give dignity and she's given credit now for kind of paving the way for Asian American actors and actresses today. You know, we cannot deny what she had to go through. It's kind of like what Hattie McDaniel, the African American actress who won the Oscar for Gone with the Wind. I think there's a quote, I'm paraphrasing here, but she said something about how, I had to walk through the back door so actors in the future could walk through the front door.
By 1910, Angel Island Immigration Station opens in San Francisco Bay.
Dubbed the Ellis Island of the West, Angel Island processed approximately 1 million Asian immigrants entering into the U.S. For many, all they would ever know of America was the view from the island.
Angel Island was a bit different. It was a place where people were taken to be interrogated and to have their immigration stories checked. And so rather than the point of welcome, it really became a point of exclusion.
It was designed to keep the Chinese out. That was their mandate. And in particular, to look for people who were coming over as what were called paper sons.
The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 destroyed large stores of public records. Thousands of Chinese took the opportunity to claim citizenship, and along with it, the right to bring wives and children into the United States.
The paper sons or paper daughter story is a very interesting one because it was the way the Chinese Exclusion Act was reacted to by the Chinese American community. So under the U.S. Constitution, everyone born on U.S. soil, except for the children of diplomats, are U.S. citizens. And so that allowed a possibility that Chinese immigrants would claim an identity.
And that's really what happened, was people would sell these to total strangers. And then those people would come over as the dubious sons of very dubious American citizens. So this is what the inspectors were looking for most of all at Angel Island, was to try to catch these people who are coming in as paper sons.
In historical perspective, and in thinking about the Chinese Exclusion Acts as a part of the discriminatory legacy, that part of American history, I think there's a certain celebration of the paper sons and his paper daughters. But the fact of it is, it was a way to get around the laws of the time.
My great-grandfather was actually a legitimate merchant, okay? We're still in the store that he founded, so he was a legitimate merchant. He was the only owner. However, he kept a list that he then would turn into the government every 6 months. And I've seen it in the National Archives, this whole file of a list delivered every 6 months that would show his partners. These were people who had paid anywhere from $50 to $500 to be on his partnership list. And that allowed them not only to come in, but then later to be able to bring in their wives and often their children if they had family back in China.
The restrictions of the Chinese Exclusion Act caused many Chinese who journeyed across the Pacific Ocean to be detained on Angel Island, sometimes for years.
Sometimes people got out in about 48 hours, often it took about 2 weeks. But some people would be detained and questioned for as long as 2 years, at which point either they would be allowed to land, they would be sent back home to China, or they would commit suicide. So it was pretty tough for people.
One of Angel Island's most famous detainees was the wealthy student Yiling Sung, who, along with her sisters, were said to be the first Chinese women to be educated in the United States. A few years later, her little sister, Mei-Ling Sung, would follow her footsteps to America, and a lifelong bond to her adopted country would form. Years later, Mei-Ling Sung would return to America as China's First Lady and would play a part in changing the discriminatory treatment towards the Chinese.
She came to the U.S. at age 8 or 9. All of her, I think her sisters were both here, and at least 1 or 2 of her brothers was actually studying also. And so she kept asking her mother to send her to the U.S. also, and her mother said, well, you're much too young. But she just kept being persistent, and her mother finally said, well, she said, it's a man's world, and if you're going to do well, you're going to have to be well educated. And so she allowed her to go with her sister to Wesleyan of Georgia. I think she always felt from a young age that whatever her brothers could do, she could do also.
No stranger to American universities is Madam Chiang Kai-shek. 26 years ago, as Mei Ling Sung, she was graduated from this same Wellesley campus with highest honors. Today, as the wife of China's great leader, she returns to meet undergraduates, American girls just like those with whom she attended school. Wellesley is proud and honored to welcome home its most distinguished graduate.
When Mei Ling Sung returned to China, she married the charismatic politician Chiang Kai-shek. As his political fortunes grew, so did hers. And before long, she would move to the center of world politics as Madam Chiang Kai-shek.
In those days, women very often were married very young, 15, 16, 18, 20, and she, in the end, she didn't get married until she was about 30, which is unheard of. In those days, it was really unheard of. She really waited a very long time, and it was considered over the hill, extremely over the hill. She was very, very choosy, and I saw in the letters to her Wellesley friend, she debated the merits of these various suitors. She was very concerned about what role she would play above and beyond being a wife. People always say it was a marriage of convenience, or they ask. That's the first question people always ask. Well, was it a marriage of convenience? What about their marriage? And, I always say it was both. Genuinely, there was love there. It was a love match. And at the same time, was it a marriage for her to fulfill her own ambitions? Absolutely. Absolutely it was.
Chiang Kai-shek began writing his diary in 1915. He wrote his diary every day without missing any single day. On that very day of the wedding, he wrote that my wife Mei Ling came just like a piece of cloud coming from the sky.
Unlike very many Chinese couples I know or knew then, they were not ashamed of holding hands in public, and when they went out for an evening walk or whatever, they would typically be holding hands. And even riding in the car, I would be sitting in the middle between, and they would be holding hands on top of me. So
I don't know if convenience is the right word, but that's the term, obviously. I think she saw in him, that he was tremendously ambitious himself, and that together they could be a team. They both had this notion that they were going to somehow save the Chinese people.
Mei Ling Sung stepped onto the world stage, garnering praise as a visionary who set a new standard for women. On the other hand, she, along with her husband, was condemned as elitists who served their own goals above China's. Those controversies continue to this day.
I just grew intrigued by this woman who seemed to be so controversial and to provoke so much emotion and passion in people, whether they were American or Taiwanese, Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese. Everyone seemed to have incredibly strong opinions about her one way or another. There was no middle ground with her. People either, it seemed, loved her or hated her, or absolutely, hated isn't the right word, despised her. Despised isn't, just this tremendous contempt, or they seemed to adore her.
It's hard for her, a lady who is Chinese but with Western background.
She had two publics that she was looking to, one in the United States and the other, of course, in China. The Chinese people very often see her as, very Americanized and not caring about China and the Chinese people, and that's absolutely not true. She was always very patriotic about China. She had this desire and a strong yearning and ambition to do something to help improve the circumstances of China and the Chinese people.
In their occupation of Nanking, the Japs again outdid themselves in barbarism. The helpless populace was trapped by the city walls and could not flee. The Japanese soldiers went berserk. They raped and tortured. They killed and butchered.
In 1941, the United States officially entered World War II. America and China were now allies in war, and Madam Chiang found herself in a new alliance with her adopted country.
I can also assure you that China is eager and ready to cooperate with you and other peoples to lay a true and lasting foundation for a sane and progressive world society which would make it impossible for any arrogant or predatory neighbor to plunge future generations into another orgy of blood.
In 1943, the year that China's First Lady addressed Congress, the Chinese Exclusion Act was still in full effect. The Chinese were still excluded from the land of the free.
And of course, at that time, there were, the United States was a divided country in a way. There's still Jim Crow in the South, Jim Crow laws, and, in many places in the country, she was considered colored. And she would not have been allowed to use the white restrooms and eat in certain restaurants and stay in certain hotels. And so you have to look at her trip in that context. And she was very much aware of all this. She would have been obviously, clearly, acutely aware of all of this. And the gender factor too. And she turned all of that on its head.
New York City gives Madam Chiang her first big public welcome to America. Thousands gathering at City Hall to cheer the American educated woman who has pledged with her husband to lead China to victory. Chinese Americans from all walks of life come to hear her and to do her honor. From City Hall, she visits New York's famous Chinatown just a few blocks away. Gala flag-bedecked streets, signs of welcome greet her on all sides. Future generations of Chinese will be told for many years to come of the day Madam Chiang Kai-shek rode through the streets of New York and won the heart of all America with her courage and her charm.
The media coverage of her trip to the United States was almost overwhelming. It was, vast majority of it was extremely positive. A woman who wasn't afraid to be attractive and feminine, and yet here she was, tough and strong. And she was very much admired by American women as well, as an outspoken woman who could, hold her own on the world stage and verbally spar with Roosevelt and Churchill, and she did. She was very, as we said, good with one-liners and very quick-witted and good at sort of repartee, and she made a tremendous impression. She lobbied also more publicly and behind the scenes for the overturning of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had by this time been in force for 60 years. President Roosevelt wrote to Congress describing the act as a historical mistake and demanding its repeal. Congress approved the repeal, and the act was sent to President Roosevelt, who signed it in the presence of Madam Chiang Kai-shek during a war strategy conference in Cairo, Egypt. Madam Chiang spent the last 50 years of her life living between America and Taiwan. During her address to Congress in 1943, she once said, "I will always look on America as my second home, and it is good to be home today." She remains buried in her adopted country, America.
She probably has many legacies depending on who you speak to. And, she was a very complex, very multifaceted woman. She was sort of placed or thrust herself into the center of a lot of the great debates of the 20th century. And she and her family, her sister, were, stood on opposite sides of the great divide of the 20th century, which was communism versus capitalism. And that's really encapsulated in her life. It's that whole immigrant experience, the Chinese American experience, and being caught between two countries and two cultures and two lands. That mirrored a whole generation of families, including my husband's family. That divide, having to leave people behind and people escaping, and it's just the horrible, painful struggles and experiences that Chinese people, whether they were in the mainland, in China, in Taiwan, or in the States, that they went through during the 20th century. And her life encapsulates all of that complexity.
The repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act ended a dark era that both Anna May Wong and Madam Chiang Kai-shek had to live through. This page of U.S. history has long since been forgotten. But more than a century later, a Chinese-American woman would seek justice in the halls of Congress.
I was a math major at the university, and I was a freshman. And I was walking across the quad when somebody handed me a flyer for something that I'd never heard of before, which was an Asian American Studies class. So I took that class, and it was like a light went off in my head. I learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act. I learned about the Japanese concentration camps. I learned about all these discriminatory laws that had served to discriminate against the Asian American community. And that's when I thought I really had to change the course of my life.
For a generation of our ancestors, like my grandfather, who were told for 6 decades by the U.S. government that the land of the free wasn't open to them, it is long past time that Congress officially and formally acknowledges these ugly laws that targeted Chinese immigrants and express sincere regret for these actions.
When I was elected to Congress in 2009, a group of national Chinese American organizations came to me, and they said, now is the time to finally get an apology for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It had been 130 years since it was passed. It was one of the most discriminatory laws ever passed in Congress. We were able to get it passed in both the Senate and in the House of Representatives. It was unanimous, and it was only the 4th such apology to ever happen in history. The American dream is so important for all of us. It's so important for all of us to have hope that we can live a better life and that we can achieve everything that we are capable of.
I think for most people, the American dream can be defined in terms of a lack of limits, of not being limited by social class, or by other factors that in some countries might prohibit a person from climbing beyond a certain level. I think the immigrants then, just like many immigrants today, found that the dream was much more difficult to achieve than they expected.
My grandfather, did he have the American dream? I don't know. In many ways, I think he had achieved from the outside looking in the American dream, but I think at heart he probably was always a sojourner, somebody who always planned to go home.
It's really important to think beyond the immigrant generation. The parents come to this country and they certainly come out of a belief that they're better off, but they're doing it for their children and for their grandchildren, and I think it's really important to think about the land of opportunity idea for the children and the grandchildren, because they're the ones that are going to contribute to America even more, and they're the ones that are going to see the opportunity that their parents helped create. I mean, I think that's always been the American immigration story. It's not just the immigrant generation. It's the children and the grandchildren. It turns out, by the way, a significant number of Nobel Prize winners based in the United States are foreign-born, or the children of immigrants. I think my daughter believes in the American dream, though I think that even as she pursues the American dream, I think she realizes that the American dream is only a half a dream for some people, in the same way that maybe has been true in the immigration history of this country.
That our brother Arthur, who was a year and a half younger than I, won first place in an oratorical contest at LA High. And he represented LA High in competition with other public schools in Los Angeles, and he got third place. And it was rumored that someone said, why do we want a Chinese to represent LA High? And his teacher, Miss Whitman, said, well, he won first prize, he was the best.
You know, I know that I'm only here because of what they did and what they went through, and that I'm on, you know, I'm here, they've carried me on their backs. We all had someone in our families that was crazy enough, scared enough, dumb enough to leave their home country and make this incredible voyage to come here to the United States.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that you will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic?
My grandfather came to this country with nothing. In fact, he faced the discriminatory laws that were in the Chinese Exclusion Act, the laws that said that Chinese Americans could not be hired by any corporation, the laws that prevented Asians from owning land, and yet he decided to make something of himself anyway. He started a small Chinese restaurant. He worked night and day and night. He used that very expensive labor, his sons, and he was able to make ends meet. And now, 2 generations later, his granddaughter can become a member of Congress. What was amazing was the next day after my victory, when President Obama called to congratulate me on becoming the first Chinese American woman elected to Congress in history. But can you imagine, we've been in this country for all this time, since the 1850s, and I was only the first Chinese American woman to be elected to Congress, and that was in 2009. It took that long, so that just tells you what kind of barriers there are for Asian American women to succeed in office.
So here you have a Chinese American woman who has come up through the ranks, has been able to build a constituency, build consensus, make change in her community. And I think that becomes, again, inspiring in the same way that Anna May Wong was inspiring, or Madam Chiang Kai-shek was inspiring, or the first woman Chinese American doctor, or Catherine Cheung, the Chinese American aviatrix. These were people who are, breaking the mold. And so you may not, if you're a young woman or a little girl, you may not grow up thinking, I really want to be a congresswoman. What you may think is, I see somebody who's out there and she's making a change in the world, making a difference in the world. And that's what I want to do.
America is truly the land of opportunity. I thank you all very much.
I really reflected on the American dream on the day that I was sworn into office in Congress. There I was, in front of Speaker Nancy Pelosi, getting sworn into office. And I could not bring my husband down there to the floor with me, but I was allowed to bring my 3 little nieces. And so there they stood behind me as I was being sworn in. And I am hoping that my 3 little nieces can see that the world is wide open to them, that there is nothing that they cannot accomplish, that there are no barriers for them in their efforts to achieve their full potential.
Thank you.